Today we're talking about Beckett. BGS. Tyler, is that your favorite grading company?
No, it is in my top five though.
Top five, that's pretty good. How many
Yeah, how
grading
about
companies
you?
can you name?
I think it's your favorite.
It is. You can see from my background versus yours.
Yeah.
You got a lot of BGS labs here. You're all PSA. What are your reasons for not collecting Beckett? Are there any?
Well, the main reason is I got into PSA early, about 25 years ago, in like 2000, 2001. I had PSA, so if I'm being honest, the reason I collect that, that's mostly the reason. I just kind of persisted with that. Um, was never really a big fan of BGS as a company. They kind of had some struggles in the last 5 years, not so much in the last year that they've been acquired by collectors, but they didn't seem to be innovating to me at all. They weren't changing with the market, anything else like that. So I never really crossed over. I know a lot of OG Jordan collectors do prefer Beckett, and maybe that's why you do. Is that why?
Well, there's a few reasons why I collect Michael Jordan and Beckett slabs, and I put this in my stories. I don't know, a few weeks ago. Like you said, there's a decent amount of them out there. As collectors who like BGS Jordans, there's a lot of big Michael Jordan cards that are in Beckett slabs, and maybe that'll change. Maybe people will cross them over, but I think there's enough of a contingency where the value difference between PSA and BGS for modern cards and other players, maybe it makes sense that you move completely away from Beckett. But because Michael Jordan in particular, and for these rare inserts, there are so many BGS collectors and BGS Jordans out there that it can kind of maintain a reasonable value. So the main reasons why I collect Jordan in Beckett slabs, one is for the subgrades because I like to see kind of an explanation for that overall grade, knowing what the issues may be for surface, corner, centering, or edges. That's kind of the number one issue, which I often hear people say is a gripe with PSA. You don't really know why you're getting a 6 or a 7 when it looks pretty clean. That's kind of the number one reason. Secondly, I don't grade things personally myself, barely at all. But the idea of being upcharged for a certain grade with PSA is not something that I enjoy. And the times that I have graded with BGS, I like paying my flat rate based on the amount of time that I'm expecting and being charged that number. Thirdly, I like the protection of the slab. It has the sleeve inside and the card doesn't move. And so that's one of the big benefits that I have for the card. Unfortunately, it's not quite as clear sometimes as some PSA slabs or CGC or some different options there, but at least it can't rattle around or move inside the slab. And then finally, like I mentioned, the value is pretty solid, but kind of nice to be able to get for example, a BGS 9 or an 8.5, a card in great condition that is just at a fraction of what the PSA cost is.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with those. I'll ask you some questions though on the subgrades. Do you really like to compare? Like, would you prefer a card that has a zero point 0.5 subgrade higher than another card, or is it more just curiosity to see why it got the grade that it got?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for me, it's more about the comparison and just to know like what happened, especially when I see something that is a very clear drop off in the rest of the subgrades. Let's say we have a BGS 8.5 and all the subgrades are 8.5, and then you see a 7.5 on the surface. Then you know there's definitely something that was wrong with the surface that could be clearly identified. And then I know like I can make the decision whether I want to buy it or not. For myself, I don't really put a huge premium on if all of the grades, for example, are nines or it's half point from the next grade, which I realize that can affect values, but for the most part, that's not a huge deterrent or issue for me.
Yeah, it would get really hard to price. It's already hard with BGS having like 10% of the market, and then they have half grades. Now you're down to 5%. And then if you're parsing subgrades. But yeah, from a curiosity standpoint, I could definitely see that. Like PSA grader notes could be something that kind of alleviates some of that curiosity on certain cards. But yeah, I totally get why wanting to know what it graded. On the upcharge, is it actually an upcharge that you object to, or is it pricing by the card value that you don't like?
I think it's pricing on the card value, which I believe happens if the card
Yes.
grades better than expected, right? Because technically you should be declaring the approximate value of the card. And for example, if it gets a 9 or a 10 and now the value bumps to a certain level with PSA, you have to pay more. I mean, I understand for like the value and the insurance of the card, but something about that doesn't feel great just because I paid a certain price for something at this level, at the value that it's worth as a raw card, just because it happens to be in great condition. Why do I need to now pay more for it to be returned to me?
Yeah, I can understand objecting to not wanting to pay by value. I think that's a legitimate gripe for PSA. The upcharge really is just because everybody would just say $1. Okay, I don't want this insurance,
Sure.
and then they'll just get charged a little. So that's the reason for the upcharges. But for the pricing by value, if you don't like that, you don't like that. I think that's legitimate.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think it becomes more of an issue when people are like, "Oh, I declared this at the lowest number. It's only worth $500," when they clearly know it's worth more. And then once it gets graded, of course, it is going to be upcharged because it's worth more.
Yeah,
Mine
exactly.
is more like because it gets a high grade, then you have to pay more for it. That's where don't love it.
Right.
But I do know there's some gripes with BGS, and I completely get some of them. One of them is the money back guarantee that PSA has, which I think is a big issue with certain Jordan and 90s insert sets, things like Rubies and Raves and Big Men on the Court, where, if it's in a BGS slab, there's no money back guarantee from what I know with Beckett. And that is, something that PSA does guarantee and has paid out in certain instances, which it sounds like that's something that some collectors care about. For me, it's not really an issue.
Yeah, same. Not an issue for me.
The value and demand, like we mentioned before, it's obviously higher value, higher demand for PSA. So fair enough if that's your reason for choosing PSA, follow the market, that's fine. And then the other reason that I can think of that I know some people have mentioned before is that a gem mint grade with BGS is a 9.5. And that just sounds weird. It's not perfect, right? A perfect 10 just sounds a lot better. And so having 10s with PSA, I think for a lot of people emotionally or subconsciously just seems like a better grade.
Yeah, I think I've heard some theories that this is certainly the case on newer cards with like maybe younger collectors. If you've been around for 30 years and you've been collecting, I think you get the fact that 9.5 is not the highest for BGS, but it's gem mint, and I think you're okay with it. For a newer collector, though, I could see like 9.5, especially when like SGC is a 9.5 and CGC is a 9.5. And no, those aren't gem mint, but you just kind of see like those aren't the top, and it's a little bit hard to equate.
So Beckett was the industry leader for many years, and only in the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, PSA kind of overtook them, and we continue to see the growth of PSA and the drop off for Beckett, especially in the past several years. A
Yeah,
couple weeks ago,
those last 7 or 8 years are probably 90% of all graded cards.
very good point there. Last year, I did an analysis of about 20 or so popular Jordan inserts to see what is the ratio in values, which I think is really important to know as you're trying to buy Michael Jordans. If you are chasing those BGS grades, trying to figure out how much you're supposed to pay for them and what's the right kind of percentage. So I just looked at what the values were for a BGS 9 versus a PSA 9. I looked at BGS 8.5 and BGS 8, both of those, versus a PSA 8. And I looked at that again this year to see what the latest was. What we found in 2026 is that gap is really widening. In 2025, a BGS 9 was about 70% of the value of a PSA 9. Again, this is for like the top 20 or so most popular Jordan inserts. I try to find things where there's plenty of sales for the data. Yeah. In 2026, that dropped from 70% down to about 60%. That's BGS 9 to PSA 9. When we looked at BGS 8.5, which now is the best comparison to a PSA 8, last year it was about an 85% rate. Now it's down to about 80%. And so it's definitely dropping. It's more drastic on certain cards that I'll cover in just a minute. But what are your thoughts on that based on what you've seen in the market over the last year?
I think this is a really important analysis, and theoretically, the value difference should be basically the percent chance that you could cross over. So if BGS 9 is 60% chance of a PSA 9, sending in a BGS 9 to PSA should cross about 60% of the time. to PSA in that grade. Again, this is kind of all theoretical. If it was much higher, then people would be cracking nines and sending them to PSA. If it was much lower, the price would drop for BGS 9. So, I mean, I don't sell a lot of BGS cards, but it seems in line with what I've seen. Um,
I think from an investment standpoint, that definitely makes sense. And also from like a grading standpoint, if you were to choose to cross, that makes perfect sense actually. I think what it doesn't take into consideration necessarily is the demand of that BGS grade as is. So if you aren't planning on cracking and going for a PSA grade, then that's a big reason I think why this drops even further, because not everybody actually wants to go through that process of cracking and moving to a
true,
different
true.
holder to sell it, right? Because if you're
Yep.
doing that, you're probably doing it for an investment purpose.
Yeah, it takes time and extra money to cross over. True.
So those were the numbers just a minute ago. It's dropped a little bit, but for the very top of the list, the most popular inserts, I picked 4 of them here. I mean, I think 3 of them are pretty undeniable. The Beam Team, the Scoring Kings, Power and the Key, and I put Meltdown here because it had plenty of sales to look at.
Yeah, I feel like that's in that group.
In 2025, the BGS 8.5 was just a little bit above PSA 8. So I think I mentioned before, it was 85% or so of a PSA 8 for the total subset of 20 cards. For these 4, it was actually even or even a little above last year. Now we're at about 70-80% range. So 25% drop in kind of the or 25% increase in PSA values of PSA 8 versus BGS 8.5 on these top 4 cards. Does that surprise you at all?
Yes. If you asked me before we talked about this, I would think it'd be like 90 to 100%.
Yeah.
That'd be kind of my intuition on this, but you know, the numbers speak for themselves. How do you feel about BGS 8.5s or point fives in general? I know PSA virtually doesn't use them. Is an 8.5 just one step above a BGS 8, or is it kind of like, oh, I'd rather just have an 8 or a 9, like it is with PSA?
Well, I think that's where subgrades matter a lot. And to some people, it matters more than others. If you have, 3 out of 4 8.5s, for example, maybe you like that card more than a PSA 8. If it's, multiple 8s and then, a couple 8.5s, it's not as good of an 8.5. That's where you get into all these little nuances, and the subgrades really matter for the comparisons. Personally, for myself, I liked BGS 8.5 for quite a while because I felt like it was great value. Again, here, compared to PSA 8, it should be a better condition card. What I've found over time is that it's the demand factor that I mentioned is just so lacking. So if I ever want to sell that BGS 8.5, it is going to be a lot harder to sell that card than a PSA 8 or a BGS 9. Those half grades just aren't quite as in demand for most people, and you're typically going to have to go, like we're seeing now, below the PSA 8 value.
Yeah, that is what I've noticed. It's really hard to sell PSA half grade because only like 1% or something are half grades. BGS is obviously much more than that. But yeah, I think people either want the 9 because, oh, it's a 9, it's mint. I'll add it to my collection and I'll feel good about that. An 8 maybe like a budget play. 8.5 maybe kind of in the middle. I'm not really sure what to do with that.
I think if you're a pure collector and you like BGS, I think BGS 8.5 is probably like the best value that's out there because you can get it below a PSA 8 and the condition is going to be probably as good, if not better than a PSA 8. So if that's what if you're just going to collect, if you're not looking to invest and see the change over time, that's a pretty good buy.
Yeah, in terms of comparing the companies, I've seen some YouTube videos that have, they'll send one card into one company, they'll crack it, send it into another company, crack it, send it into another company, and they'll get different grades. And people say, "Oh, it's inconsistent. These graders don't know what they're doing." I think it's important to note that these are completely separate companies with completely separate scales. Yes, an 8 may say near mint mint on both, but just because you send in to one company, crack it, and send it to another company, it's different. Really doesn't speak to consistency at all. Like why would they be consistent? They're totally different companies. It's one thing if you send to the same company and you get different grades. That of course is inconsistent. But
I think we've brought this up before. I mean, grading is completely subjective. It is based on a person until we get the robots or AI to do
a
it.
trained person though, and they're trained differently with different standards.
Correct.
Just like,
Absolutely. But at
university degrees, Harvard is probably going to be better than, whatever school you went to.
definitely better than the school I went to. Yes.
The training can, certainly impact the subjectivity.
Well, that and also just the experience of the grader and how many times that they have seen
Yeah,
a scoring Kings Michael Jordan, how many different graders there are at PSA versus at
sure.
BGS, right? Like if you have 100 people, even if they're trained the same way, you're going to get some variance and a wider range of variance in the grades that they're going to provide. BGS, you're going to have fewer. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. BGS, I think maybe there's more experienced graders from the amount of Jordans that they've graded in the past, but just given the scope of it, there's so few cards that are graded in all with BGS. I think long story short, there is just like grading is not going to be consistent, whether it's with a certain company or between companies, and there's no reason I think to think that it's always going to be consistent.
Yeah, totally agree.
BGS 9 to PSA 9 with even bigger of a gap. Last year, for these four cards, the most popular ones, BGS 9 was about 70% of a PSA 9. And again, this doesn't take into consideration subgrades, so it's not perfect math, but about 70%. And now it's more like 50%. And a lot of that is probably influenced by recent sales that we've seen on PSA 9s of Scoring King, of Power and the Key, and BMT. Actually, all four of these have skyrocketed, and BGS 9 has increased, but not quite as quickly. Do you see this continuing?
Well, I think that it depends on why we think that this phenomenon is happening. Do you have any theories?
I think there are quite a few reasons and theories out there that could all be true. One of them is PSA collectors who can no longer afford a 10 are now moving down to a 9, or they can't afford a 9, they're now moving down to an 8. And so the relative prices of those grades that may not be the highest grades, the prices are
Demand is
increasing.
increasing for PSA because people are kind of going down the chain.
Exactly. A PSA 10 Scoring Kings Michael Jordan just went for like $60,000.
Right.
You can get a PSA 9, which used to be $3,000 a year and a half ago. Now it's I don't know, was it
10 or
$15,000?
15 or something. Yeah.
$12,000. So it's still like percentage wise so much less than a PSA 10 that there are more people in the market now for that PSA 9, thus driving up the prices. That's kind of like the main theory that I would think of for why PSA 9 is going up so much.
I have two theories. Mostly for why BGS is lower, not necessarily for why the gap is widening.
Okay.
But one, this I have no evidence of this. This is just a theory that people have put out there. If in fact PSA is getting stricter in their grading, as some people think, it's kind of a widely known theory, no proof to it. But if they are getting stricter, and maybe what is a 9 or what is an 8 now might have been a 9 in the future, theoretically, the newer PSA grades should be a little bit higher. Like a 9 is really like a 9.3 or something. Obviously, they don't have those numbers, but if they're getting a little bit better, then people are willing to pay more for them. Maybe if you're looking at an old label 9 and a new label 9, a new label looks a lot better, so people are willing to pay more, and that's widening the gap. Maybe.
Yeah. I think that's definitely a valid theory that, there's fewer 9s that are handed out now. And so the 9s that are existing are worth more.
And another theory could be PSA really kind of floundered for a few years, at least when I was paying attention, from like 2021 to 2025. They weren't growing as a company. They weren't innovating. They tried to change the scale and got huge backlash from that. Meanwhile, PSA was just growing and growing and growing, therefore getting more and more market share. And, there's a lot of people who want consistency in their collection. If I have 90% of my cards as PSA because there's just so many more out there, maybe I just want to keep with that and stay consistent and not buy BGS. People might have been turned off by BGS. I know I was, as somebody who looks into the businesses of these companies, somebody that's just not innovating, not changing, not keeping up, not growing, it really turned me off. So maybe more and more people are like me and they got turned off. Not as many OG collectors, and they're just like, if you get a lot of new collectors, okay, who should I grade with? Well, PSA is number one. Let me just go with them.
Well,
When market share widens, the that's what winds in their collections.
I think that explains kind of the change over the past several years. The last point that you mentioned, I think, explains this phenomenon over the last 1 year, which is that there are so many new Michael Jordan collectors, or so many new collectors moving into the Michael Jordan market who
Mm-hmm.
may just be completely used to only PSA and only wanting PSA. And so, again, that pool of demand of collectors is so great that now, people trying to choose that PSA 8 or 9 or 10, they're just driving up the prices there.
Yeah, and market share doesn't just persist for the time that you have the market share. Like again, when people want consistency in their collection, the more market share you have now, the more you're in the news, the more you grow. Just all new collectors kind of gravitate toward that high market share. So back to your original question, do we see this persisting? If there's truth to our theories, then yes, I see it persisting because I don't see BGS really cutting into PSA's market share right now. I don't know why collectors would. They're certainly not going to kill BGS, but they're not going to like really push to ramp it up. So yeah, I see it persisting.
I think it could mean the opposite as well. Like we may be completely wrong, right? It could mean that PSAs are
Always right.
yeah, we're always right. Maybe PSA is just moving up way too fast, and maybe the rate of growth the past 6 months, in particular, is just way too high, and that BGS has some room to grow. So there is that possibility that's out there. You and I obviously are always right about this, but in this case, we have no idea what's going to happen. I think it's a better bet though that PSA will continue to stay well above BGS for a while.
50% for BGS 9 to PSA 9 seems pretty drastic, pretty far away. Uh, I mean, given what I just said, if it goes to 40 or 30%, that seems kind of outrageous. I can see people saying, hey, a 9's a 9, I'll just go with the BGS.
Yep.
So, yeah, by that token, BGS could close the gap a bit.
I didn't cover any other grading companies. I also didn't do anything with BGS 9.5 this time around because it's just too many nuances with the minimum gem versus a true gem, not enough of a sample size. And obviously the 9.5 versus 10 price is just, the gap is too extreme to really compare at a large enough level. So
this was a good analysis though, and pretty interesting to think about.